People are still coming in. All right. Welcome to Anderson Ranch and our summer faculty lecture series. If you have your phone, please either silent them or turn them off. My name is Joanna Lee. I'm the ceramics coordinator at Anderson Ranch. I want to start by recognizing that the Anderson Ranch campus resides on the historic tribal lands of Ute people who called this area home for over 800 years. In honor of this legacy, we focus on building an inclusive community here, maintaining this as a place for inspiration and creativity in the center of the Rocky Mountains. Tonight's program will consist of 2 faculty lectures followed by a question and answer. First, I would like to introduce Joanna Poag. Joanna Poag loves tactile and process-based nature of clay and has held dynamic studio practice for the past 10 years. Her work explores memory as it relates to line, color, and pattern. She holds an MFA from RIT and has participated in several residencies and recently exhibited with Soft Time Gallery in San Francisco, California. In addition to her art practice, she teaches at Liberal Arts University in Rochester, New York, where she lives with her husband and 3 young children. Please help me welcome Joanna Poag.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I wanted to start with this work for several reasons, not because this is what my work looks like anymore, but I was making these works from 2015 to 2019. But I think there's a couple crossovers in this work that I was making to the clay collages that I'm making now. So you can see that I've been interested in multiple components coming together to create a larger composition. And they're kind of strange, these works, because they're 3-dimensional, but they also have like a very 2-dimensional quality as they hang in space. And I've always kind of been interested in that liminal space between flat and 3-dimensional. And so that's definitely carried over into the work that I'm making now. And so these pieces, I'm thinking about sound waves. I'm thinking about how sound might move through space. I'm thinking about objects on a plane. I'm thinking about like cross sections of some kind, and a lot about the physical weight of a mass that's hanging in space. So you can tell that from these last 2 pieces, color was not a focus of the work, so that is a substantial change for me, but line and space and light were pretty important to me. During COVID, I lost my access to my studio, and I had a couple of bags of clay in my basement, and so I cleared a space and made little structures, the ones that you're seeing on the left, and filled them with different components. And so it actually ended up kind of being like a log of quarantine, where I would make one of these per day. And so I had work that started in mid-March, whenever the initial lockdown happened, until July. And so I think like I wanted to experiment with color a little bit, so that was sort of my foray into doing that. But I also wanted to develop a little bit more like intuition into my practice, and so adding like little objects into these structures kind of helped me do that. And I see that as kind of a collage process where I'm creating a structure and then I'm filling it with other things or other ideas. So these are, I mean, I really responded to what Mildred was saying when, is she here right now? Oh, you are, hi. Mildred, what you were saying with your talk on Sunday, and how your studio practice changes based on the spaces that you have access to. And I also feel like my practice kind of has had that ebb and flow. I started making collages, paper collages, in 2019 after my second kid was born. And I don't really consider these completed works. I think they're kind of works that I feel like are peripheral to my practice, just kind of doing them in a moment, right? But they were pretty pivotal for me in my studio practice. And so when I think about like my experience becoming a parent, I don't think I was really prepared for that. I don't know if anybody ever is really prepared for that, but I hadn't expected to have to be physically available every hour and a half for my child. And so the long days that I would put in the studio just weren't possible for me anymore. And so I started making paper collages on my kitchen table because they were quick to pick up and put down, and I wanted to focus on incorporating color into my work and having my practice become really intuitive and responsive so that each component I put down, I could respond to that. Before that, the larger work that you saw, all of the creativity would happen before I actually started making in clay. So I would do my ideation, and I would create that in Illustrator and print it out. And so the piece was already done before I even touched the material. And so I'd wanted to sort of change that to allow my practice to be a little bit more intuitive. So after making about 100 paper collages, I realized that was the work. So I sort of pivoted my practice substantially, and I taught myself how to mix pigments into my clay, and basically just followed a very similar process that I had done with my paper-making collages, but in clay. So these are panels, like you would see a painting panel that hang on the wall. And I think collage is a really wonderful tool because it allows you to take all the different parts of your life and kind of transform it into a new story or a fresh dialogue. And I was talking to my class last week about Wunderkammer, which are the 16th century curiosity cabinets, where they were used to where people could kind of put objects and photos and poems and natural materials into this structure and kind of observe the connections between those ideas and find new relationships between those objects. And the idea was to create wonder and awe towards God. And then as culture shifted, it became less about directing wonder towards God and more about categorizing things and making sense of them from an analytical perspective. So I really feel my practice is kind of doing that, kind of exploring those connections between the parts of my life that don't feel like they necessarily have a connection or make sense. A little bit about my process. I typically create 2 patterns in pigmented clay and then kind of stitch them or splice them together into a formal composition. And I think there's something really beautiful about disruption because it alters our expectations, but it also creates room for growth. So a while ago, I was listening to a podcast by Brian Greene, who's a physicist, and he's written a book, I think, called Fabric of the Cosmos, which is basically just string theory for regular people. And I really liked how he described the universe pre-Big Bang as being, the best way he could describe it as being incredibly smooth, but in that smoothness there was nothing. And then post-Big Bang, you see substantial disruption and irregularity, but it's in that disruption and irregularity that growth is allowed to sort of come forth. So I'm definitely thinking about that as I sort of structure these. I'm very interested in textiles and flowers because of their connection to femininity. And in the 1940s, fabrics surfaced that were called ditsies and dum-dums, and they were essentially all over flower prints. And I think there's a lot of connection between what is culturally expected of women and the prints that are manufactured for our use. And I'm interested in how those expectations may or may not influence behavior. And then the piece on the left, Nightshade Lullaby, you can't necessarily tell, but originally those were nightshade flowers that I had created and then cut up into that composition. And I think that nightshade is a plant that we connect to beauty. It was used as a makeup in the Middle Ages, but of course we also know its connections to witchcraft, and because it was used as a poison, but also was supposedly the thing that witches would use in order to fly on their broomsticks, right? So I'm interested in how plants are used to communicate qualities of a woman or connecting how a woman's supposed goodness or badness based on their proximity to a plant. does that make sense? Well, we can talk about it later if it makes sense or not, okay? So I'm very interested in how plants are used to, connect or communicate qualities of a woman. Daisies are another flower that I think are considered very like innocuous or sweet and cheerful. And they're also historically connected to fertility and motherhood. If you think about like growing up and perhaps playing like he loves me not, right? Which is really an incredibly violent game if you think about it, because you're essentially dismembering this like daisy as you're trying to figure out if the person that you're interested in is perhaps interested in you. So I'm thinking a lot about like what is the relationship between the perception of the flower and versus like the reality of the plant, which daisies are like pretty hardy plants, I feel like. I also think like textiles and quilting are another way of communicating or coding information that I'm really interested in. Like there's of course a rich history in the United States of quilts communicating important cultural ideas or poignant personal moments or connected to deep spiritual practice. And particularly with enslaved Black women, quilting was a way to communicate important information without being caught by enslavers. So I think that what I hold on to about that is that these works communicate to some, but not to all. And that resistance can be this intentionally subversive thing. And so I'm very curious about that kind of subversive communication through pattern. So what I will do often in my work is sometimes I'll create like source material that's very representational, and usually is in regards to like what I'm thinking about or reading or experiencing, and I will chop it up and rearrange it so that it's not recognizable. And I think that the collage has the ability to kind of like disrupt that representational image, but it also has the ability to hide information that sometimes isn't clear to anyone else but me. And I think there's something really valuable for me, and I'm not really sure if I know exactly what about it is valuable to me, but the parts of my life are like embedded in the work, but the content is sometimes obscured from others, and I'm kind of interested in the work's ability to do that. I also repeat morning stars a lot in my work. So, I mean, depending on the culture that you're from, they have different cultural meanings, but I'm interested in it from the perspective like personification, right? Much like my interest in like textiles and flowers. So what we consider, you know, the morning star, the evening star is actually the planet Venus, right? And from, Venus is considered feminine because she's part of like the Roman canon, and is connected to like love and beauty and power and victory, right? So I think what's interesting about that is that cultural overlay on a planet that we typically think of as, like I was reading an article that suggests, or that said that Venus had hostile surface conditions. She's a planet that's hot, she is covered in sulfuric acid, and she's like not hospitable to humans. And so I'm interested in like what it might mean to be Venus, like a woman who is like the goddess of love and beauty, but is not hospitable and is in fact hostile. And so that's kind of a curious relationship that I'm interested in. I also think materially, I'm taking textiles or quilted motifs and flowers, things that are perceived as like delicate and soft and warm and connected to ideas of nurturing, and then I'm turning them into stone, which is, kind of an unyielding, like kind of unforgiving process. So I think this like meaning kind of changes the meaning of the work a little bit because there's a nod to softness, but it's just kind of a nod. And that if you think about the stages of clay, right, clay it's going to be very soft and responsive at first when you're using it, and then later it's going to become much brittle, and then its final stage is basically going to be like unmovable. So I think that's kind of an interesting thing that I think about in terms of like how my material plays into the kinds of things that I'm making. And I'm not making a lot of like installation sculptures currently, but I am still very interested in shape and how it has the ability to activate like the space around the work. And I'm mostly looking for shapes that are kind of open-ended. They can be maybe multiple things. And so I'm thinking about how the patterns and the shapes move through that exterior shape. Sam Gilliam, a painter, had a little snippet of an interview kind of floating around Instagram recently about abstraction and talking about how abstraction was a way to communicate that there was more than we could physically see or understand. And that what we know isn't all, and there's something very beautiful about a willingness to explore something that is unknown to us, or maybe explore it differently than we have before. So, I think I'm a person who is very interested in information. I sometimes feel like I'm just a vacuum for information, and it just I can't help myself. I just want as much information as I can get my hands on. And I think that art making for me is kind of about embodied knowing rather than just cognitive understanding. So something in my head is not the same thing as feeling it in my body. And so I think there's kind of a search for embodied knowing when I'm making this work. And I'm clearly, at this point, interested in color. And I'm not always often able to get it in clay, but I'm interested in vibrating boundaries, when there are two colors next to each other that are kind of a little bit painful to look at, because I want my viewers to kind of have to work to understand the work, and I want it to be perhaps a feeling that isn't quite peaceful, but is a little bit uncomfortable or unsure. I'm also interested in how color relationships, in this piece particularly, kind of allow the florals to disappear into the background. And I think about how we pejoratively talk about a wallflower as someone being on the fringes of action without actually participating. And so once again, I'm interested in how the florals kind of communicate, and the color allows me to communicate a little bit about perception of women, I guess. I really do feel that I'm exploring the range of my human experience, and that means I'm doing more than just exploring the uncomfortable parts or the parts that I feel like the parts of my life that I feel like I have trouble with or are difficult for me. But I also think that what I'm doing is kind of exploring the joy and the delight and the celebration in my life. And I think it can be a marker of the passage of time, but it's also exploring those momentary, fleeting moments that range from the super mundane to the more extraordinary. And I think, I have 3 kids. Their ages 8, 6, and 4. And I feel that my life is pretty chaotic currently, and I think that's reflected in the work that I'm making. And I think sometimes what I'm surprised about is when I look back on the completed work that I've made and see that it can feel chaotic, but there's also a joyousness and a delight in exploring all these textures and patterns. And sometimes when I'm in the midst of the chaoticness of my life, the piece allows me to realize something that I didn't notice in the present. So I think working through that and being able to look back on the work that I've created has kind of been a satisfying experience for me. And I hope that my work transcends what I'm thinking about in terms of cultural expectations of women, and is also just more about my own delight and engagement with the things that I love and enjoy. These are some newer pieces that I made, so I'm not really sure how I think about them necessarily, because I just made them. But you can see that the space is very compact. How I'm using the space is very compact. This is one of my favorites of the new batch. And I'm thinking about the connection between the natural and the digital as it kind of relates to a glitching or a disruption. And I also think it's not necessarily outside of our cultural experience that I'm working flat. We're often looking at a screen, which is flat, and so we experience we experience our life through this very two-dimensional lens. And so I guess I see that as an afterthought of my work. It's not something I consciously was thinking about when I was working in this way, but I think working flat I don't know, oftentimes that's how I'm experiencing part of my life. And then these last works, like my kitchen vignettes, I think historically women have been given like leftovers where they're like either the cultural scripts that we have or like physical scraps that they've been given. And they use those scraps to like create and transform something out of a creative need, but also it's turned into often things that are prized and appreciated communally. And I think there's something that is so resilient about being able to take disruption and turn it into like a new kind of story. And so making this work as a way for me to embody or honor that resiliency of myself, but also others who make alongside of me and have come before me. So that's it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Joanna. Our next speaker is Letha Wilson. Letha Wilson was raised in Colorado and is currently based in Prairieville in Brooklyn, New York. She earned her MFA from Hunters College and attended Skowhegan. She is represented by Grimm Gallery and Gallery Christophe Gaillard in Paris. She has recently showed work at Mass MoCA and the Cordova Sculpture Park and Museum. Please help me welcome Letha Wilson.
Hi, everyone. Hopefully I can speak okay. I have a tail end of a little cold. And I completely changed my artist talk this afternoon, so, because you know what, I've done it 7 times here, and so we want to make it a little different, but thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be at the ranch. My name's Letha Wilson, and I grew up in Colorado. I grew up in Greeley, and then my family moved to Grand Junction, but we spent a lot of time. This is a photo kind of for my family archive. I think my dad took this photograph. So starting in about 6th grade, we would take these week-long backpack trips in the mountains, always in Colorado. And even though I'm sure I was kicking and screaming at the time, not wanting to go on these trips, those were experiences that ended up really being poignant for me as I moved to the East Coast. So basically, I went to Syracuse for undergrad, and I've been in New York State ever since. So at first, I thought I would try to go from I was inspired by Holly's talk and doing like very recent works. I was gonna do like going from present backwards, but I could not figure out how to do that. So I'm gonna start out with something very recent and then kind of circle around. So this is an artist book that is just now being finished. This is my 4th artist book. So, sorry, to back up a little bit. I was a painting major in undergrad, but I was really interested in combining media, mixing media, learning different techniques, sculpture, photography. And then in grad school, I was always like returning to these images of the landscape and the Western landscape. And it was in grad school that I really decided to kind of, but at the same time, as a person living in New York City in this urban center, I was really responding to these like buildings and architectural spaces. So, and I really wanted to like build things that were massive. So it was in grad school where I first combined this idea of photography and sculpture, and specifically landscape photography. So I'm all about sort of what are the rules of how a photograph should behave, and then what are some other ways around it. So I'm interested in physicalizing a photograph, specifically landscape photograph, to get that experience of interacting with that image to be a little bit more similar to that original experience in nature. So this is my 4th artist book, and they always have actual cuts. That's like a hole punch that I found on Amazon. And I'm just gonna flip through a few. This book, I also included some black and white photograms. I do still love like going back to the darkroom, and a lot of my early work was analog, and I find a lot of comfort in that process. So I included some in this book. There's actual folds and cuts in the book. So after it's printed, I go back through by hand and sort of manipulate pages. I just took these photos like this afternoon in my studio, but just to give you a sense. If you want to see it, it's up in my studio here in the painting department. Little rips or holes, peek-throughs, what's behind an image, what's in front of an image. And like a kind of roughly cut with scissors hole. Thinking of the back of a photograph or the front, which way you approach it from. So, okay, so that's like a little moment of what I'm working on now. So then I was thinking about, I think when I started working with photography, originally the material I was working with was styrofoam and these kind of extrusion pieces. But after kind of breaking it down, I really wanted to work with materials that had a conversation with landscape and sort of architecture. So I was interested in the dual nature of, say, like a 2x4 that did come from a tree, or paper that came from a tree, or drywall that's essentially gypsum and that. So the kind of origins of these materials that now are these sort of ubiquitous architectural materials in our lives. So metal and steel made sense to me as a material that also fit that category. So this is one of my first pieces with steel, and it's actually just a C-print mounted to a piece of steel that's kind of curled up, and it's kind of funny because it's this beautiful landscape that I took in the Great Salt Flats, and you can't see it at all just because only the corner is showing. And my dad hated this piece. I probably said that before. He said it was for the earthworms. But he mostly liked my art, but it was just this one piece really bothered him, which I thought was kind of amusing. And so originally I was like mounting photograph C-prints to steel. This is another earlier piece where I'd like welded, plasma cut the image so there's a hole and a burn through the photograph and the metal. And there are often these sort of minimal disruptions into the landscape. And so then I discovered UV printing. UV printing, also called flatbed printing, basically a process where the ink is sprayed down onto the surface of the material and then cured with UV light. And we have a small UV printer. Oh, shout out to the Fab Lab. Can you hear me? They said they were going to yell. They're all here? Okay. My Fab Lab students, I thought they would be up there. But there is a small UV printer here at Anderson Ranch, which is a pretty rare treat. Delayed reaction. Thank you, Fab Lab. Also, thank you, Leah, for ordering the UV printer. But anyways, years ago. So the first time I really decided to work with this process, I kind of went super big. So this is an outdoor sculpture. It's about 1,000 pounds. And the pieces of Corten steel were actually directly printed, then welded, and then assembled. This piece is now at my house, so if you want to come see it, it has changed a little bit. And then the back of the piece, the back of the steel will change and rust, and these pieces will change over time. There actually is a sculpture at Anderson Ranch of mine. I'll show an image of it. So I started working with UV printing, and it was really interesting because you can really kind of print on everything. I'm kind of known for this series of pouring concrete onto photographs. I have hundreds of these pieces, and in these cases, I'm also UV printing on top of it. Oh wait, I want to use this laser pointer. So these green stripes are basically like, this is a photograph. I poured concrete onto it inside this frame. And then I took the whole thing to the UV printer and printed over it. So it prints over the frame itself and everything. So this was another one along those veins. It's kind of cool because, this is some technical things, but the image focus points on the front, on the very top surface. So in these lower areas, it gets very diffuse. So this piece is about 2 inches thick and has a lot of movement front and back. And then this piece, which looks a lot different now, but this piece is here at Anderson Ranch. The backside, oh, I love this thing. The backside of the steel has rusted quite a bit, you'll see, and it changes over time. So this piece, oops, sorry. Actually, going back to the idea of the artist book and like what images on the front and the back of the pages, working on those books kind of led me to the sculpture and thinking of there's multiple images. There's another image on the back of that other piece, and thinking of like the relationship between these two images. Oh, I forgot to sign it. And another outdoor sculpture that I did that's currently at Rochester Institute of Technology. So yeah, occasionally I get these commissions or opportunities to do large pieces, which I really enjoy. But one thing, so again, talking about things that happened during COVID, those large pieces had to be fabricated at a metal shop, and I really missed the hands-on process of making in my studio. So when COVID happened, my husband got a job in Hartford, Connecticut, and there's a really cool maker space there, so I took a whole bunch of welding classes and metal classes and started making sculptures on a scale where I could fold them, weld them, and assemble them myself. So these are a few of those, and you really see the kind of burn. Like I'm literally welding the image after it's printed onto the steel. So this piece also has 2 images. This is the back. This is another image, another sculpture. There's an element of brass in there that's held. And that's the back side. And also these wall pieces where there's holes. I'm always thinking about like what's behind a photograph, but also really thinking about the wall and having it be part of the piece. So then this series is, so all this work is like within the past 4 years. I did this show at the gallery Higher Pictures, and this was one project that I worked on. It was just one of these projects that took way longer than it should. But I really like the idea, and again, it was sort of coming from a book page of a show where it was like one book was the whole show, and each page could be either shown on the wall or shown as a sculpture. So I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to hinge these pieces. Now this is the actual piece is like this big. So each piece in this project is a single image that's sort of divided by 4. And there's holes, beep, 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 that line up, so you could fold it up into kind of a book. So this single piece could be shown, and then the backside is steel. So I'm just gonna flip. These are all the ways that little baby could be shown. Partially folded against the wall. Hung as a sculpture. So I don't know, I'd like to continue this project on a larger scale, but I just loved the varieties, the fact there could be dozens and dozens of ways of looking at this piece from different angles and things. Another one from that series. So I printed them on steel, copper, and brass. And for me, the raw material has as much weight as the image, like it's just as important to me. Sorry. And all the photos I take myself. Maybe didn't explicitly mention that, but mostly from the Western United States. But I like to go west and shoot. There's a view from the gallery, so you can see they're relatively small pieces, but they change. And then this is like my most recent large-scale piece. I do love working at a site-specific way. This was a gallery at SUNY Purchase, where I was an artist in residence. So this piece is called Slit Slot Canyon. And there's a hole here, and there's a window up here, so the light kind of comes down through and creates this kind of sunbeam effect. And the hole, so it's, a giant hole cut out of the drywall that's sort of cantilevered out towards the viewer. And then this was from a show a year ago in London. Again, UV prints on thin steel, sort of wrapping them around these frames. Having moments where you can see through to the wall, adding elements of brass. I feel like the learning curve for me and metal has been quite steep, so I just kind of have to keep going. Like, I'm really interested in it, so I'm learning quite a bit as I go along. How to finish and patina them. Really imagining, or like having this steel really like nestling on these why am I using this so much? But it's so cool. I've never really gotten into the laser, sorry. It's like a whole new world. This is a photo I took at Craters of the Moon National Park in Idaho. So a lot of it is kind of this mathematical challenge. I do like that. And just this simple act of sort of bending or folding the image and how much that changes how you interact and understand it. And the same show, I did several slotted sculptures so they can kind of disassemble and travel more easily. Just keep it on time. These are little babies. They're like this tall. So that would be like different sides. So from different angles, they look quite different. And from one side, you wouldn't ever see the image on the other side. And another large outdoor sculpture, which was a commission for ICA San Diego. This is an Encinitas. This is a permanent piece that was installed less than a year ago. And again, the back of this piece will kind of change and rust out. There's these two view holes. I really wanted to bring the concrete back into the work as sort of an element. So kind of creating the step that's part of the work. Just gives you a sense of the scale. And some really close-up view holes. This was also a cool project because I got to go, this photograph was older from my archive, and I got to spend time in Encinitas and took this other photo from a hike in the area. And then this was like one of the last pieces I made at the end of last summer. Kind of a small piece. The photo from Joshua Tree where I folded back the steel bed, painted it white, so it almost looks like paper. And also really really ground down the edges of the frame. Sorry guys about the pointer, but whatever. So I really was interested in this sort of theme. So something happened this summer where I had this commission literally drop onto my lap. And so now I'm gonna show you a very recent work that was hung this morning at the Armory Show. A series of 5 new pieces. Similarly, having this sort of more raw steel. So, this is a photo I took in Hawaii of lava, and having the metal element kind of poke through there. I learned how to anneal for the first time. I annealed copper, and I bent it there. And this photo is from Valley of Fire. So a lot of times the frame is, in some ways, the starting point or the beginning that these images are kind of pushing off of or responding to or encapsulated by. Some details. This project kind of broke my brain, but in a good way. I learned a lot. And just painted, this is all steel and brass and steel. So I don't know, I think it's just like I'm very interested in how the combinations of these processes and materials have a conversation. And, I'm also, personally, like I have gone to these places, so I think I carry a memory of these situations. I really enjoy working with the landscape because I think everyone has some sort of relationship with it, and it might be a memory of a smell or a scent or a sound, and so something to kind of trigger that memory. And this is at the Armory Show in New York, if you happen to go there next weekend. That's it.
All right. We're gonna ask all the.
I'm so into this. I'm taking this
You are.
home.
You should take it.
The pointer, I've never realized.
Great. So, thank you. Any questions? Let's run.
Letha. So I'm over here. It's
Oh, Holly.
Yeah.
Wait, can I say something, Holly? Really quick before you
Yeah.
ask me a question, because I forgot to say this in my talk.
Okay.
But at your talk, when you said that you were doing these photographs and painting on them and how excited photography people were to kind of break out, and I feel very similar that when I started working in the sculptural way, they were just looking for a way. No offense, Andrea, or sorry, the photo people in here, but you know, like the same thing. I feel that people were kind of looking for another answer, and I was in kinship with your feeling of that.
Well,
Anyways,
Great. Anyway, thank you. So my big question is, your outdoor stuff, how does it hold up under the weather? I mean, they're photographs, but whoa, how do you do that?
well, the first one I did was just a big old test. That piece is in my house. I could have put some more recent images up. I'm interested in how the materials change over time. Like, I think it's insane to think artwork won't change when it's outside, of course. The nice thing about Corten steel is it will just continue to rust. The image side is a little more of a question mark. I mean, this is new technology. The piece I have outside has been outside continuously for 10 years. And it depends on what angle, because there's different angles to the piece, like how much sun it gets. So some of it's faded and some of it hasn't. But I kind of find the conversation really interesting, so.
Well,
TBD,
In
TBD.
another 10 years, will it be completely faded like
Yeah.
the poster hanging in your
I don't know.
bedroom?
Maybe yes, it could
Yeah.
be. Well, that first piece, I did not put any coat on it at all. This piece, I put some protective clear coat on it.
So it's like a clear protective coat?
Yeah,
that-
like a UV,
UV.
protectant, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you both that was very inspirational. My question's for Joanna. I'm interested about in the presence versus absence of fingerprints in some of the pieces, and wondered if you could just talk about that.
Yeah, so when I started doing it, I think I didn't leave any fingerprints at all, and then I realized that I was making in clay, and so having fingerprints would make sense and also sort of be a record of the responsiveness of the material. So I don't always include it, but I think I am a little bit more careful to press in areas that I think need some kind of like cohesion or like mushing together, or being more willing for like the different layers to exist in the piece. I don't know if that was like super clear on the flatness, but there is kind of like a small dimensionality to the work. And I think being able to tell that they're different pieces that come together, even though essentially they're all the same material, is important, I think, just for like recording the responsiveness or just being another marker of like time passing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much both for your talk. I really love seeing both of your work, and I think something that I'm thinking about now and looking at your work, and I don't know if this question will make sense to either one of you, but it is a question to both of you, is about how, I think this was true about you both, one of you sort of said it, the other one did, but like how you're relating to the idea of like the container for the work. So I think, Letha, you sort of talked about it a little bit more, but I think in your work,
Yeah.
Joanna, I was seeing that, or I think I was seeing it, that there was the information, but in some of the work there was like a very clear container that was holding it, that was part of it, but felt separate. And so I'm just curious how you're both thinking about this idea of the container or the frame or whatever, however you're thinking
Great
about
question. Yeah, I think in the very last series I was saying, I think often, you know, if the frame or the container of the piece is kind of part of it, but also this sort of limit to the piece, maybe physically, in some ways, if you have this container in advance, then you can play within that frame. But I think so much about how like an object is held to a wall, because I think that there's just a vast amount of ways this can happen. Like framing is one thing, and especially with photography, you just assume it's going to be printed. It's under mat board, it's under glass, it's all this stuff. And once you get rid of that, what are other ways it can live and inhabit the world? So is the frame something that like helps it, or is this frame something that hurts it? I don't know, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a good, I haven't really thought about it that much as being like a method of containment, but I am putting a very distinct border around some of the pieces. And I think, I do that in some of my pieces and not in others. And I think the ones that I'm doing it in, I really am thinking about how that edge of color will kind of hold in the composition. Even in some of like, the one, I don't know if you remember the work with the morning stars and then the black and white. I'm thinking about how fabric kind of like folds in or contains or kind of wraps in. And so I think that border helps to sort of add to that sense of like safety, or I guess containment. It's so interesting because in ceramics, of course, I think we think about containment all the time, but then I'm making this flat thing, so I'm trying to like not think about containment, but I guess you can't get away from it, so.
One more thing, thinking also of your works of like pressure, like the sort of pressure of containing something, and it kind of, because there's this sort of sense of the face, things being constricted into the space.
Absolutely. Yeah, I definitely am thinking about that. And I think about it from, I don't know, sometimes from like my life choices. Like, are my life choices actually like constricting me and providing me boundaries that are like uncomfortable? Or do I like the structure that I've created for myself? And how do I sort of like deal with that dissonance from day to day?
Thank you both so much. It was a wonderful talk, and I'm taken back by how there are so many overlaps between the two of your work. The idea of a rectangle, flat surface, a folded surface, and the use of materials are very specific in each. Can you talk more about what fold means to you?
Why do I have to go first? Okay. Yours are folded. No, that's a great question. But yeah, I was also just thinking of your work too. I think it also is something about like pressure or malleability or double-sided or different angles, just this idea of multiplicity in the work and like viewpoints that is complicated.
Can I say something about? Yeah. You're like, okay, so when I look at your work, and I know that I'm understanding it from like my own perspective or interest in like the idea of like a glitch or a disruption. And I think for me, seeing like the fold in your works, or like the empty spaces in your work, is kind of not allowing you to fully engage in like the texture or the natural environment, because you're constantly sort of like pushed back and sort of seeing that fold as a disruption to our expectation of like what landscape is, or how we interact with like the space as a whole. Yeah.
And I think like when I kind of began, I've been working for a while with trying to sculpturize photographs, for lack of a better term, but I'm always amazed at how a simple move such as a fold or a sort of, skyline being suctioned into the ground, how it completely changes a piece, or if it's poured concrete and weighs 300 pounds, but those things that you really, and to me, it needs to be then experienced in real life, like it is an object, like what I'm making is an object. So I think the physicality of a fold or a tear or a bend makes it kind of real for me.
And I think for me, thinking about folding, I'm usually thinking about it from the perspective of a textile, and thinking about how the pattern of the textile gets folded or wrapped around something. And so there is kind of like an alteration to the structure of the pattern, or there is like a tucking in, or like a, maybe even thinking about how like you might take a piece of fabric and twist it, and how the twisting of it kind of changes your perception of the pattern. Yeah, that's a really good question. I need to think, I'll think about that a little bit more. Okay.
All right. Any other questions? No? All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.